Stephen met three old friends at a neighborhood bar they had been visiting together for years. Tonight was supposed to be a simple celebration after his recent promotion at work. Someone raised a glass to Stephen's success, and everyone joined in without hesitation. The conversation quickly drifted into old memories, new plans, and plenty of laughter. The server returned again and again with drinks, appetizers, and another round that nobody had originally planned. Each decision felt small enough that nobody stopped to think about it. Hours passed almost unnoticed as the table grew crowded with empty glasses and shared plates. Stephen realized he hadn't looked at a single price all evening. When the bill arrived, he reached for it almost instinctively before anyone else could. His friends thanked him, and he smiled as though covering the entire table was the most natural thing in the world. Welcome to Lion Invests. This channel isn't about getting rich overnight. It's about understanding why we make the financial decisions we do, because once you understand the pattern, everything starts to make more sense. If that's the kind of thinking you're interested in, I'd love to have you subscribe. Now, let's get back to the story. Driving home, Stephen kept replaying the evening instead of simply enjoying the memory. One moment continued bothering him more than he expected. He remembered picking up the bill without hesitation. What he couldn't remember was making the decision to do it. I know what you're thinking because Stephen asked himself exactly the same question. How could something that expensive happen without feeling like a decision at all? The following morning, he found an old photo from years earlier at the very same bar. The faces were familiar, but the night looked completely different. Back then, they split every appetizer, counted cash before ordering another drink, and joked about staying within budget. Every small purchase had once been part of the conversation. Stephen looked from the old photo to yesterday's receipt resting on the kitchen counter. Nothing about the restaurant had really changed. Somehow the prices hadn't surprised him, the bill hadn't worried him, and paying for everyone hadn't even slowed him down. That was the part he couldn't stop thinking about. Before leaving for work, Stephen quietly folded the receipt and slipped it into his wallet instead of throwing it away. For reasons he couldn't explain, it suddenly felt more important than the money itself. Stephen never found anything unusual about the receipt, the restaurant, or the bill. The only thing that had quietly changed over the years was the person making the decisions. That night was never really about dinner with friends. It was the moment Stephen realized that earning more money had slowly changed what felt completely normal. What Stephen experienced is surprisingly common, although most people never notice it while it's happening. As income grows, our expectations often grow alongside it, quietly redefining what feels ordinary. That's why a raise doesn't always produce the lasting relief people imagine. The financial situation improves, but the emotional finish line often moves at the same time. Stay with me, because this isn't about spending too much or making bad decisions. It's about understanding a pattern that quietly influences millions of people every day. Imagine receiving a 10% raise after several years of hard work. At first, every paycheck feels noticeably larger, and every expense feels easier to manage. Then everyday life begins adjusting around that higher income without asking for permission. Small upgrades slowly become routine until they no longer feel like upgrades at all. The nicer restaurant becomes the regular restaurant, the occasional treat becomes the weekly habit, and yesterday's luxury quietly turns into today's expectation. Nothing dramatic happens, yet your definition of normal gradually shifts. Behavioral economists have studied this pattern for decades because people adapt remarkably quickly to improvements in income and lifestyle. The human brain is designed to normalize repeated experiences, even positive ones. Stephen's evening at the bar wasn't unusual because of what he spent. It mattered because it revealed how easily our financial reality can change without our awareness. Here's what makes this pattern so difficult to notice. Nothing feels different from one day to the next because the change happens one ordinary decision at a time. Think back to something you once considered a luxury, there's a good chance it eventually became part of your normal routine without much thought. That isn't necessarily a mistake because improving your quality of life is one reason people work so hard. The challenge begins when every improvement quietly becomes the new minimum. A nicer apartment feels exciting at first because it represents progress. Months later, it simply becomes home, and moving somewhere smaller starts feeling like a loss. The same thing often happens with cars, restaurants, vacations, subscriptions, and everyday conveniences. Each upgrade feels reasonable on its own, yet together they quietly reshape your monthly spending. Most people don't wake up one morning and decide to spend dramatically more money. Their lifestyle expands gradually until yesterday's budget no longer feels realistic. I thought the same thing the first time I noticed this pattern. Surely earning more should automatically create a greater sense of financial comfort. Sometimes it does, especially when higher income is directed toward long-term goals or financial security. But many everyday decisions happen automatically before we ever stop to evaluate them. Imagine someone earning an additional $1,000 each month. If $600 quietly disappears into lifestyle upgrades, the remaining progress naturally feels smaller than expected. The math isn't complicated, yet the experience often feels confusing. People wonder why they feel only slightly better despite earning noticeably more. The answer isn't always hidden inside the numbers. Very often it's hidden inside expectations that have quietly expanded alongside those numbers. Expectations behave differently than income because they rarely stay still for very long. As circumstances improve, our definition of enough often moves just a little farther away. This is one reason financial satisfaction can feel temporary even during periods of genuine career success. The achievement is real, but the emotional baseline keeps adjusting. Stay with me because this is where the pattern becomes easier to recognize. Once you see it, you'll probably remember moments from your own life. Think about your first meaningful paycheck. It probably felt larger than you imagined before everyday life slowly caught up with it. Then came another raise, another promotion, or another opportunity. Each improvement brought real benefits, yet the excitement rarely lasted forever. That's not a personal failure. It's part of how the human mind adapts to repeated positive experiences. Psychologists often describe this process as adaptation because emotional reactions naturally become less intense over time. What once felt exceptional gradually begins feeling expected. From an evolutionary perspective, that ability helped people adjust to changing environments instead of remaining distracted by constant excitement. The same mechanism now influences how we experience financial progress. In today's economy, adaptation can quietly blur the difference between wants and needs. Things that once felt optional slowly begin feeling essential. That shift happens so gradually that very few people notice the exact moment it occurs. Looking back makes it obvious, but living through it rarely does. Stephen didn't suddenly become careless with money that evening at the bar. His habits had been evolving for years, one comfortable decision after another. His story simply made the invisible visible. A single receipt reflected a much larger pattern that had been building quietly over time. The important question isn't whether you should enjoy earning more money. The better question is whether your expectations are growing faster than your financial progress. Because once expectations begin setting the pace instead of your priorities, earning more can improve your income while leaving your overall feeling of progress surprisingly unchanged. At this point, it might sound as though the solution is simply to spend less money. That would be an easy answer, but it would also miss the deeper pattern completely. The real issue isn't that people enjoy nicer experiences as their income grows. The issue is that expectations often grow automatically while our awareness stays exactly where it was. Imagine two people who both receive identical raises over the same 5-year period. Their incomes increase by the same amount, but their financial lives slowly begin moving in different directions. The first person treats every raise as permission to permanently raise everyday spending. Each upgrade feels reasonable, and none of them seems significant on their own. The second person enjoys some improvements too, but intentionally leaves part of every raise untouched. Instead of upgrading everything, they preserve space between income and lifestyle. Here's where things change because both people probably feel equally successful at first. The difference doesn't become visible until several years later. The first person now needs a much higher income simply to maintain what feels like an ordinary life. Reducing expenses begins feeling like moving backward instead of making a choice. The second person experiences something different. Because expectations grew more slowly, each new opportunity creates genuine financial flexibility rather than immediate obligation. This is why income and wealth are not exactly the same thing. Income measures what comes in, while wealth reflects what remains available after today's decisions are finished. Stay with me because this distinction quietly shapes almost every long-term financial outcome. Most people focus on earning more, while paying much less attention to preserving flexibility. Throughout history, rising incomes have often been accompanied by rising standards of living. That's a natural part of economic development and improved opportunity. But history also shows that higher living standards don't automatically create lasting satisfaction. As societies become wealthier, expectations often continue rising alongside prosperity. That's one reason people from very different income levels can still describe feeling financially stretched. Their circumstances may differ dramatically, but their expectations have adjusted to match them. Economists sometimes call this relative comparison. People rarely measure progress against their past alone. They also compare themselves with the world around them. A salary that once felt extraordinary can begin feeling average after enough comparisons. Nothing changed about the paycheck itself, yet the emotional meaning quietly shifted. Stephen wasn't comparing himself with his friends that night at the bar. Without realizing it, he had been comparing today's normal with yesterday's normal. That's an important difference because one comparison creates perspective while the other quietly erases it. The more quickly expectations move, the harder progress becomes to recognize. Think about your first apartment, your first vacation, or your first reliable car. Each milestone probably carried a level of excitement that eventually faded into everyday routine. That fading isn't evidence that the achievement wasn't meaningful. It's evidence that human beings adapt remarkably well to improved circumstances. I know what you're thinking because this can sound discouraging at first. If adaptation is natural, does that mean lasting financial satisfaction is impossible? Not at all. The lesson isn't to avoid progress, but to become aware of how your expectations evolve alongside it. Awareness creates something adaptation cannot quietly erase. It gives you the ability to notice the moment ordinary comfort begins becoming invisible. Once you recognize that pattern, future raises no longer carry only one question. Instead of asking, "What can I upgrade?" you also begin asking, "What do I want this income to accomplish?" That small shift changes the conversation completely. Money stops becoming only a tool for expanding lifestyle and starts becoming a tool for expanding choices. And that's the moment Stephen's evening at the bar becomes much bigger than one dinner with friends. It becomes a mirror reflecting one of the quietest patterns in modern financial life. Once money becomes a way to create choices instead of simply creating upgrades, the emotional experience of earning more begins to change. Progress becomes easier to recognize because it is measured with intention instead of habit. That doesn't mean refusing every nice dinner, vacation, or celebration with friends. Those experiences can add genuine value when they are chosen consciously rather than accepted automatically. The important question isn't whether something is expensive. The more useful question is whether the decision still feels intentional. Small moments are often where this pattern quietly reveals itself. A subscription renewed without thought or another dinner out can say more than a major purchase ever could. Here's the strange part, because these decisions rarely feel significant on their own. Their influence comes from being repeated so many ordinary times. Imagine every raise creating two possibilities instead of only one. One increases your lifestyle, while the other increases your future flexibility. Neither choice is automatically right or wrong. What matters is making the decision deliberately instead of letting it happen by default. That's why awareness becomes one of the most valuable financial skills a person can develop. It helps separate intentional choices from habits that quietly formed over time. Stephen's story reminds us that financial patterns rarely announce themselves with dramatic moments. More often, they appear during completely ordinary evenings that seem forgettable at first. The receipt he kept wasn't valuable because of the amount printed on it. It mattered because it marked the first time he questioned something that had always felt normal. Most people never experience one dramatic event that changes how they think about money. Instead, understanding grows through small realizations that slowly connect into a larger picture. Those realizations don't always change your income overnight. What they often change is the way future decisions are made. Over time, that difference can become more meaningful than any single raise. Not because the paycheck matters less, but because your relationship with it becomes more intentional. This is where financial psychology becomes more powerful than simple budgeting advice. It asks why decisions happen before it asks how to change them. Once you understand the pattern behind your choices, many financial behaviors begin making far more sense. The mystery isn't where the money went. It's why the decision felt so natural. Stephen walked into that bar expecting nothing more than an enjoyable evening with old friends. He left carrying something much more valuable than a receipt. He left with a question that many people never think to ask themselves. When did this become my normal? That question has no single answer because every person's journey is different. But asking it is often the beginning of seeing your financial life more clearly. Making more money can absolutely improve opportunities, reduce stress, and expand future possibilities. Those benefits are real and worth pursuing. But lasting financial progress depends on more than the size of a paycheck. It also depends on whether your expectations grow more slowly than your opportunities. The distance between those two things quietly shapes how progress feels over time. Protecting that distance is often easier than trying to rebuild it later. That's why understanding your own behavior is just as important as understanding the numbers. The decisions behind the money often matter more than the money itself. Stephen's evening was ordinary in almost every possible way, yet it quietly revealed a pattern that millions of people experience without ever noticing. Sometimes the biggest financial lessons don't arrive through market crashes or life-changing events. Sometimes they begin with an ordinary dinner, an ordinary receipt, and one unexpected question. And perhaps that's the real lesson. Making more money changes your life most when it changes your awareness, not simply your income.